We are recording. Welcome,
Okay.
everybody.
Hello, everyone. All right. So today, what we're going to do is we're going to be looking at how we can use some of the skills that we kind of already have from the last few lessons, and we're going to be looking at how to make very simple objects inside of ArtMatic Voyager. Simple DF, what we call DF objects, depth field objects. So in this particular tutorial, I have both Designer and Voyager's apps open, which you need to have when you're working with DF objects. And I will also select, when I'm inside of Voyager here, inside of Designer actually, what I'm going to do is I'm going to select this little icon over to the left, which is the icon that allows us to communicate between the two apps. It won't make any difference just at the moment. When we start to get into some objects, it actually will. So first I'll do a little bit of an explanation. Actually, no, let me load up something. What I'm going to do is I'm just going to go into the object editing window, and we can get into it by clicking this icon here, or I often use the Command B to do this. I think actually maybe even it's just B. It might even not even be Command. No, it is. It's Command B, or that little icon there, which is the objects, which enables the objects editor, and it will bring up this little window which says DF objects, and you have a whole bunch of slots here which you can put a DF object in. So I'm just going to very quickly open up an object, and I've got a selection of very simple things here, and I'm going to put in a simple plane, what I call a simple plane. Why did it not do that? Come on. Simple plane. Doesn't like that. Oh, I know why. I'm doing the wrong thing. Silly. Did you see what I was doing there? I was trying to open Voyager thing. I need to open, obviously, a designer file, because that's what designates the actual object itself. Now, so what I put in here is actually, this is probably the most simple of all of the things that you can do. It's just a flat plane, and you saw what I had before I did that was just a blank window. I've basically made it so that Voyager has no planet, so I've taken off the planet. So the inbuilt planets will actually give you landscapes, but you have a selection of things that you can do here, and I've just selected to no planet, so it's basically nothing at all. And I've also selected it to be a clear sky, so there's no coloring or clouds. Well, there's coloring in the sky, but there's no clouds. So just to keep everything simple. And I can change the sky color just by clicking here, and I can make it whatever I really want it to be here. But at this stage, I'll just keep it a sort of a sky bluey color. And I have an infinitely receding flat plane here, and that's courtesy of that DF object that I loaded, which is a simple plane. Now, when I'm inside the object editing window here, if I click over here on this icon here, this is editing the simple system that I've selected here. If I had a second one here, it would do that one instead. Whatever I have selected in this slot will be affected by these icons. So I could open an ArtMatic system here. I can open it from here. I can reload the system. You don't really need to reload systems so much anymore. That sort of happens automatically. Or I can edit the system. So if I click on this, what will happen now is it will jump immediately into Designer, and you'll see that we have a fairly simple system in here. And the system that I have in here is the object is this, and it's I'll show you where it is. It's called dot plane line, and it describes some very simple geometry for the DF fields. At the moment, as you'll remember, if we have, oh, that one doesn't do that. That's interesting. Anyway, so you have a number of different selections for this particular component, and I've just selected it to its simplest, which is a positive DF plane. And when I have this icon here selected, that will open the Voyager Preview down here. Can you see that? and that just shows me what's in the Voyager window. So if I flip back into Voyager, and I'm actually going to be flipping back and forwards between both Voyager and Designer in this tutorial. And the way I do it, and the way that I recommend you get into the habit of doing it, because it's very, very fast, is to use Command Tab, which will tab you through whatever things you have open at the time, and it will toggle between the last two. So Command Tab. And it's a really useful thing to remember if you're doing this on one screen, because it's just a really fast way of going, now I'm in Voyager, now I'm in Designer, now I'm in Voyager, and you'll want to do that a fair bit. It's just better than trying to do it from the menus or trying to click on the backgrounds and things. It's just a quicker way of doing it. So the description that's in place in this DF slot here at the moment says basically create this flat plane that goes off into infinity. And when we look at it inside of Designer, this is what we see. It's kind of almost the same thing. We're looking at the side of the plane. One of the things that you may want to get into the habit of doing when you're creating DF objects inside of Voyager and Designer is to select a different. We can't do it here. I'll have to show you this in a minute. Don't just forget what I said, because I need to reconfigure something here. You'll see what I mean a little bit further down the line. There's a better way of viewing DF fields inside of Designer, but I can't show you here because this is not quite set up for it at the moment. But I'll show you how that is. So a depth field object is basically an object which is described by the depth or the distance the object is from the camera. It's a different form of modeling to the conventional 3D modeling as we know it, which is done with a system of manipulating polygons. And if you know anything about conventional 3D applications, you'll know that if you want to make something like a sphere, you have an object and it has a certain number of polygons, and that will define the sphere. So the more polygons it has, the more detail it has. And the more detail it has, the longer it takes to render. So that's not the way that depth field modeling works. Depth field modeling works by kind of plotting the distance from the camera to the boundaries of an object in simple terms. There's some advantages of doing it this way. One advantage is that it renders far more quickly than a conventional polygon object because of the fact that a polygonal object has to be rendered according to the complexity of the polygon. So it's not so much of a problem if it's just a sphere, but once you start to get into complex shapes with more polygons, then the CPU or GPU that's required to render those things increases. Whereas it's kind of not like that when you're inside Voyager using depth field mitigated objects, because of the fact that the way the calculations are done are simpler. And it means that you can technically have incredibly complex objects inside of ArtMatic Voyager that can render reasonably quickly. And an example of that would be 3D fractals. And at some stage, I'll do a tutorial with 3D fractals and I'll show you that. You can have incredibly complex 3D fractals that render faster than nearly everything else inside of Voyager. So the complexity of what you're seeing doesn't dictate the rendering time as it would definitely if you were doing stuff in polygonal modeling. So if you were to model something of the complexity of one of those fractals in a 3D app, it would take a very long time to render, whereas in Voyager it doesn't. So at the moment, what we're seeing is a plane that goes off into infinity. It's actually determined by what we've told it to do inside of ArtMatic Designer. And it's a very simple object, so it renders very, very quickly. It only has one kind of very simple description. But I'm going to show you something before we go into actual putting some objects in that you know as real objects. I'm going to show you the basic mechanism by which Voyager actually creates landscapes. And when you see this, you'll understand a few fundamental things about it. So to start out modeling a landscape, an actual landscape in Voyager, you'd probably start with something like this. And the basis for all of the landscapes that you have in Voyager that come as the under the hood things that you get with the application kind of are based on this very simple idea. And I'll show you what it is. Here we have our infinite plane, and I'm going to just change it very slightly by adding a component above it. It's just at this stage, it's a 3D component, 3 in, 3 out. And I'm going to change that component. I'm going to modulate the system. I have to move this because I can't see everything. I still can't see everything. I'll just take that back here. I'll move that window. I'm going to modulate it with a very simple noise. This is a random vector noise, and this noise is a 3D noise. So what it's going to do is it's going to modulate that flat plane in 3 dimensions with a 3D noise. And when I do that, you'll see straight away that that looks sort of like a landscape you might see in Voyager. I mean, it's very, very primitive because it's a very simple system. But straight away, you can see there's an infinite landscape of kind of hilly looking things. We'll just flip over into Voyager and have a look at that. And you can see there they go off into the distance. They look a little bit like wobbly hills. And just like any landscape in Voyager, if I grab this and we go above it, we can look down on it. We could theoretically travel across it. We could go right down amongst it like that. And we can look around inside it. So it is really, really like the way that the landscapes are actually made in the standard Voyager landscapes. And you can make your own landscapes by making these mathematical descriptions and then coloring them in certain ways. And Dick Scherzinger, who is very good at this, has in fact made some very complex worlds using these techniques. But they are basically the same techniques that describe the landscapes that you get as default landscapes. So I just wanted to show you that, just so you can kind of see how Voyager thinks about these things, how it thinks about depth field and the way that it actually makes its landscapes. So let's just, I'm going to flip back across. So I can go back into Designer in a couple of ways. I can just toggle back, and because we're linked at the moment, whatever I do in there will actually be reflected in there. Or whilst I'm in the DF pane here, I can actually have it selected and I can go back into it by doing that. I'm going to take away this component. We'll go back to our flat plane. And as you see, the Voyager Preview updates to a flat plane. And if we toggle back into Voyager, we're in a flat plane. And I'm going to add another object in here. I'm going to open, I've got a simple sphere here, and I'm going to open that. And you'll see we're now back in our flat plane, and we have a sphere, and the sphere is kind of embedded in the plane. I'm going to just go up a little bit with some elevation. Just going to go up a bit higher so you can see how that works. Let's go up a bit further. And I'm going to move that sphere up a little bit by changing its altitude. I can do that in a number of ways, and I'll show you an easy way. So at the moment, these are defaulting to the standard designer kind of defaults, and so they'll always appear right in the middle of the designer field, and they'll always appear at origin of the world. We're at world origin because we've selected home here. I just kind of elevated the camera up a bit so we can look down on it. And I can actually now move the objects in a number of ways. So in CTX, we have the ability to actually select a DF object here. And over here, you'll see this is actually selected. So under objects, it'll be selected. And I can now do a number of things to change where it is in the world. But all I really want to do is move it up a little bit in height. So I'm going to move it up to 50. Let's a little bit more. Let's go to 60. So now our sphere is actually hovering above our landscape. We switch the shadows on. We'll see that. So the sun is obviously shining on the sphere, and then it's casting its shadow onto a flat plane. So let's have a look at the sphere inside of Designer. So what's happened here is I have two things selected. Whichever one of those is selected, if I click on the Edit ArtMatic System button here, will take me to the ArtMatic system that is responsible for that particular object. And you can see here that, again, this is a very simple system. In fact, I can even delete that bottom tile, and you'll see it's just one tile, and it describes a sphere. There are a group of different things you can choose as objects inside of Voyager and Designer. So let's just look at those. So it's this little bunch here. These are shapes, and they will allow you to create different kinds of shapes. Let's select the first one here. See, and we'll select box. And you'll see straight away that our object over here has changed into a box. We can change it to a cylinder. We can change it to a cone, and it will just keep on updating to whatever those things are. So here we have a sphere sitting inside the Voyager landscape, and it's determined by this one tile. This 3 in, 1 out tile determines that it is an actual shape of some kind. First thing I'm going to show you is how you can actually alter the orientation of those shapes. And the way to do that is to put in a tile above it. Now, remembering from our earlier tutorials where I said you can basically think of things as like tiers of things. The stuff that's above an object actually influences their space, and the stuff that are below an object usually influences their color or is a mixer of some kind. And it's true for 3D objects as well. So what we have here is a tile that I put above it here is a space tile. It's basically going to change whatever happens spatially to this particular object. And I'm going to change it to a rotation tile. And instead of just 2 axes of rotation as you'd have when you're working in the flat Cartesian 2D systems of Designer, we now have 3. We have got 3 dimensions, which of course we need to have if we're working in 3D, because we want the depth and the height and the length as well. So, and width as well. So if we look here, we can see that we can actually manipulate the object in these 3 dimensions. We can manipulate the orientation of the object. So let's just do that really roughly. And you'll see that this cube is actually rotating according to how I've changed these 3 faders here for their orientation. So there's a very kind of brief way of how you can actually change the orientation of the object itself. It's, as you can see, very, very simple system. Just 2 tiles. I think, you know, as I go through this, I'm just going to keep stopping and asking if everyone's keeping up and got questions, because this is the kind of tutorial where I don't want to get too far ahead, and I don't want to say things that you know that you're missing. I don't want to gloss over things. So, Steve and Andy, is that making sense at this point?
Yeah, good. Yeah, very clear.
Okay, good. All right, and obviously now where we can get to from this is that we can add other kinds of things to this tree, to the top of the tree, and those kinds of things will influence what happens to the object. So this is an offset tile. It's a 3D offset, so I can now offset this cube in 3 dimensions. I can actually bring it closer to the camera or take it further away from the camera. By doing that, I can have it go up or down by using the y-axis and left and right. So straight away, you'll see that that kind of changes something that we had going on in Voyager. So I've moved that cube a little bit around, but I can also move that cube inside of Voyager directly. So this is something to keep in mind, because once you've started doing this kind of movement here, this is a movement that's in relation to the home position, the 000 position of things inside of Voyager, but I can also move them inside of Designer. And those things are independent. So it's really, really important to understand that those things work against one another or for one another according to what you're doing. And this will become really pertinent when you start to try and animate motion inside of Voyager, because you really need to understand that you're moving it here and you're also moving it here. And it's possible to animate the motion in both Voyager and also in Designer. So it's something to keep in your mind, because it can really stitch you up if you're not really careful. So I'll just mention it here, but later on, if we have enough time, I'll go into a system where I'll show you how to move something very simply in an animation. We'll move a cube or something, and I'll show you how it works and how to set up simple movement paths. But for the moment, I'm going to switch us back to our, well, first of all, what I'm going to do is go back in here, and I'm going to just reset all of this stuff. So our cube is back there, and I'll reset the orientation as well. And I'm going to change the cube back to, back to a sphere. There are a couple of ways of defining spheres actually now, and cubes, because there's actually a different tile. So some different shapes. This one here will allow you also to define a whole group of different shapes, and some of them repeat. And I think that's largely to do with the legacy of older systems. But you will find that it's better in most cases, if you can, to use this top one here, because one of the things that you'll find yourself wanting to do frequently with objects is to change their size. And if you are in the other ones, you find that it's actually a little bit more difficult. Let me just see, I'll show you. So you can change the radius of the sphere here, but you can't really change much else. Whereas if you're in this one here, we have sphere selected. You can actually change some of the other parameters of the sphere. You see, as soon as you start doing that, it becomes more like a box. But it means you can actually, there's one thing that we'll probably talk about at some stage, and not in this lesson maybe, but one of the things you have to be very careful about with creating depth field objects is that you don't exceed their scaling parameters. It's possible to actually get it to a point where the scaling is incorrect, and your objects will either render incorrectly, they'll look wrong, or they'll look horrible, or they'll look okay, but they will cause you to have an incredibly high render deficit. So you might have the scaling out of whack. And this, in this particular case, for instance, if I have my sphere, well, let's go back to this one here and select the box here, give it a bigger radius. See how quickly that's updating in the Voyager window there. It's quick. It's very quickly updating when I change it into something else, almost instantly. It's because it's a very simple description and its scaling is absolutely correct. If you get the scaling wrong, it's possible for that, even that simple sphere, to suddenly go and slow right down as it renders. And the scaling is actually dictating that. It just means that the mathematics of calculating where the boundaries of the object are in relation to the camera view are not correctly defined. And it's one of the mistakes that people start to make very quickly when they start to move around depth field objects, because they try to do things which the actual maths doesn't like. So
where are you controlling the scaling just of that sphere?
So that's inbuilt to the actual object, Andy. So here, there's a radius control. So I can actually change the radius of this thing in here, and it will always be scaled correctly as far as the depth field goes. Just to show you what I mean, if I change this tile here to a scale object, it probably won't create any problems in this stage, but I can actually technically scale this object from here as well. So if I was to do that, I can actually push the scaling up, or down there, actually, let's go up. Oh, what am I doing? Going the wrong way. Doing something wrong. So the scaling is actually increased quite substantially here. And it's fine for this particular thing because it's a very simple object. But behind the scenes, altering the scaling like that is not a way that you probably should do it, because it will actually have ramifications as your objects get more complex. That kind of scaling doesn't work so well. You can do it, but you just have to know how you're doing it, and often you need to recorrect for it somewhere else in the system. So changing your objects, the recommended way of doing it is changing them within the object parameters here, because the scaling will be correctly calculated if you do them inside here, but it won't
apply if you wish to keep the scaling of objects relative to each other in a complicated thing. I would have thought, because in Voyager, you've got the ability to scale vastly more easily.
Yeah, that's right. And you have to be very careful of that. So obviously, and it's like I was saying with the movement, you can move things in Designer relative to the way they are in Voyager. You can move them in Voyager, and the two things work independently of one another. And it's the same with the scaling of objects. So here, if I set my scaling here at 7, it makes the sphere at that size, but it's dependent upon what the object scale inside here is. So I could set it to 100 here, whoops, and it gets very large inside of Voyager, but it's still scaled inside of Designer to 7. So you have to be careful about that kind of thing. It can actually confuse you quite a lot. The best thing to do, and it sort of depends on lots of things as well, because sometimes, you know, the object scale is kind of irrelevant. Sometimes it is relevant. Sometimes the lights are affected by the scale. So if you downloaded my hot air balloon, you'll notice that I say keep the scale to 30, because the lights don't behave the same way. If you scale it up to 100 or scale it down to 10, the lights won't behave correctly because of the fall off of the lights and various other things. That's all to do with the way that DF light works, which is its whole other subject as well. So yeah, there is a way of calculating the size of things when you're inside of Voyager as well. And Dick made quite a good little simple tutorial, which we should probably try and post up somewhere, Caleb, just to show you when you make something inside of Designer and put it inside of Voyager, how big is it actually? Because that's quite a useful thing to know. One thing that you can use as a scale meter, if you like, or something you can tell with scales, is if you put a sprite in and you use one of the inbuilt figures, one of the figures that comes with the Voyager suite as a sprite, the human figures, they're about human height. They come in. They come into the Sprite Manager. So if we evoke the Sprite Manager, come in, and you bring in one of the figures from the suite, it'll come in at sprite height of about 1.9 meters, I think. So they're roughly human height, and they're a really good way. If you plonk one of those into your scene, it's a really good way of actually measuring the scale. So if you plonk a human figure in there, it'll pop in around about human height. And so if you're making a potato, you'll be able to actually work out how big that is in relation to a human. I often do that. I'll just plonk one in while I'm working and I can see how big it is compared to the human. So for instance, my Zeppelin that I made is approximately the right size for humans inside the landscape. So the next thing I'm going to, so basically what's happened here is if we look in these systems, our simple sphere, when we go across and examine it inside of Designer here, is really only outputting one output. And as far as Voyager is concerned, what that means is that it has no color. It's just mapped to a default neutral white. There's no actual color. So the next thing that you may want to do with your systems is to add color to them. And now this kind of brings us into the way that the RGB color works inside of Designer, inside of Voyager rather, and Designer. So I'm going to show you how to do that. what Voyager expects to see if you're going to put color in an object is a tile that has 4 outputs, because 3 of those outputs are going to tell you what the RGB values are, and the other of those outputs is going to tell you what the DF description is. So we need a description that says we've got a sphere, and we need 3 channels of color. So let's stick one of those in right at the bottom here. I'm just going to put in a tile, and by holding down Control, I'll get the window that shows me what I can choose from. And I'm going to put a 4 in and a 4 out tile. Straight away, you saw something happen with the actual object. It got a color. It's not correct, but it got a color. I'm going to show you how to kind of map this correctly. So first of all, I'll put it to the alpha scale and offset, which is kind of like a good default tile to use. And I'm now going to connect, first of all, I'm going to connect this tile correctly. So I want the DF description to go down one side only. And so I'm going to go in here and I'm going to disconnect all of those things. So I've only got just the DF description, which is just one tile going into that right channel, okay? And you'll see now there are some spares, and that's what we expect because we want to allocate some color. So I'm just going to click that. Now, there is color flowing in here, but it's kind of completely unterminated. So we have this kind of weird thing here. We want to have control of our color. So we have to actually connect something to those 3 inputs. And the easiest thing to connect to that is just to, I'm just going to put a branch tile in. I'm going to make it a 1 in and 3 out. And I'm going to put it to a constant. That's a constant RGB color. I think we discussed those in one of the earlier tutorials. And I'm going to now, so I'm actually holding down Command and Option when I do this. So I'm selecting the tile I want to connect, holding down Option and Command, and it will bring up this window. So I can now go connect the blues together, connect the greens together, connect the reds together. And as we expect, we have our constant now showing the color white, which is going to the thing. It looks exactly like it did before because the default color is just a blank white. But now it gives me the option to put a color in here. And so I can do that by grabbing a color from the color wheel here, and I can make my sphere any color I like. So you see now we have a green sphere. As I think I mentioned in an earlier tutorial, this connection to this tile is really quite irrelevant. We can actually disconnect it because it's not actually putting any information into the tile at all. So if I just do that same thing again by holding down Command and Option and just disconnect this, you'll see it doesn't make any difference at all. It doesn't actually need an input, that color component. So I can change, obviously change that to any color I want. It'll just reflect its change over here. And so that's one way to simply color an object, a very simple, quick way to color an object. So let's go back here. Now, one of the things that I should explain to you, as we're doing this kind of changing, because we're in a linked ArtMatic system, so as I flip back and forwards here, this linked system is updating itself all the time. So as soon as I save this Voyager file, which I'm doing just using a Command S to save it, it's also saved the file in the Voyager bundle. It's now bundled with Voyager. So what does that mean? That means that if I was to load in my simple sphere again from that ArtMatic designer file, the one that I had as a designer file, it will now go back to the way it was. It will not be uploading the file that's inside the bundle. Does that make sense?
Yes.
You have to be mindful of that. Once you've hit this link button and you're editing back and forwards between Designer and ArtMatic, you are actually updating the package file, the bundled file for ArtMatic. So it's now not paying any attention to any other ArtMatic file you might have originally loaded in here. It's a thing to keep in mind because it can actually confuse people. So just
does that mean that if you, let's say you've done that and made a few changes that way, when you're back in the ArtMatic designer file, if you wanted to save it as it now is, apart from in the bundle, would you have to do like a save as? And
yes, if you
yeah.
save it here just with a save command, it's saved into the bundle. If you want to save it as its own thing, you'd have to make a save as and then save it as a separate file. So for instance, if I go in here now and I just get rid of this simple sphere. So I'm going to just get rid of that entirely. And now I'm going to open my original simple sphere. Oh, I know why. Yes, because I did a save as, because I did a save while I was in ArtMatic. That's the trap that you have to avoid getting into. If once I'm in here, I do a save, I need to do all my saving from inside of Voyager.
Right.
Yeah. Because if you don't do that, if you don't do all your saving from inside of Voyager, then you're overwriting your older ArtMatic file, which is desirable in some cases, but you have to be mindful that that's what you're about to do once you hit the save button in here, because it can actually save something else. Sometimes I'll do this as a matter of course because I want to keep updating that ArtMatic file that I was using, but mostly it's probably best just to keep on saving in here and just ignore that and keep on flipping to the designer file via that. And that way you're not saving in here, you're saving in here, so it's saving to the bundle. It's probably the
If
safest.
you've got Time Machine running, you can of course go back and rescue the file
Yes.
you actually overwrote.
Yes, yeah. It's a trick and you should be aware of it, and I get trapped all the time. You know, it's not something that, you know, it's not intuitive to the highest level of your brain, especially if you've got an old brain like mine. All right, so I'll show you what happens when so I'm going to go back to the simple plane just here. I'm going to click on the plane, and now I'm going to load the plane, and we're back on the plane where the rain in Spain mainly falls. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to change the color of the plane. I'm going to do this again. I'm just going to repeat what we just did. So I'm going to turn this tile into a 4 in, 4 out. I'm going to make it an alpha scale tile. I am going to create a branch by hitting B. I'm going to turn this one into a 1 in, 3 out. I'm going to make it into a constant. And I'm going to automatically connect it. And the way I did that was just to hold that tile and then click on Command and the other tile, and it automatically connected. It will do that in some cases, but not in all cases, which is why I often go through the process of selecting it and then doing the Option command and doing them manually, because it will always work in this case. So 2 ways of doing that. And now I can change the color of the plane to whatever I want just by selecting a color here. Now, what you'll have noticed maybe as we were doing all of that kind of stuff is that we changed from having our this palette here, which is kind of meaningless when it comes to DF objects, but still stays in play. We've changed to the RGB palettes here. And you'll see there's things that make sense: RGB alpha and density, multi not quite so much, bump has its own particular kind of meaning. You want to mostly stay in the density one because that'll give you a better feeling for what you're doing inside of Voyager. But there's also another one which looks a little peculiar, and it's geographic. What does that mean? Well, this is the one that we mostly use when we're trying to model things inside of Designer. Because it gives a better understanding of the DF shape. Let me just check the sphere here, and we'll go across to our sphere object, and we'll look at that. And the reason that we use this when we're doing modeling a lot is we can tell a lot of things about how the DF is working if you're in this geographic model. And what it tells you is the kind of this sort of beigey kind of color and the greens, they're well within the boundaries of a good, properly designed, properly scaled object. As we head off out into these other colors, that's where you're starting to see the definition of the boundary space. And if you have a very badly defined DF object, you'll see that you get all kinds of other colors there. If you see those other colors, what you should see is this kind of thing, these lovely colors from green into kind of beigey colors and the blues. And there should be a good boundary between them. They should look nice and defined. If you start seeing all these other colors like violets and pinks and things, you've got a very badly defined DF object and you need to fix the scaling. It's just we'll see some of that in later tutorials. I'll show you how horrible that can be. So in this particular case, we're actually looking at the RGB density because we're interested largely in colors because we want to see what kinds of colors we can do on these objects. One thing, so obviously, because this is a 3 in 3 out, we can actually map any kinds of color systems to it. And there are a lot of color systems inside of Voyager and Designer. So let's just have a look at what the potentials are. We'll go to a 3 in 3 out. Okay, it's not a color tile at this stage. It's not a proper color tile. It's just taking the values. I'm going to connect it over here. Doesn't make any difference to what it does. Just makes it a bit neater. And I'm going to select from a group of tiles that allow me to tell it what colors to be. One of these is the caustics tile. So you see that it's now mapped this caustics pattern correctly to a sphere. If we go over into Voyager, and let's make our sphere a little bit bigger with the object scale. This is actually now correctly spherically mapped in 3D to the sphere. So it doesn't matter where we are, we can be all manners of space around this object, and it will look correct wherever we're sitting on whatever side of the, oh, oopsie, wrong thing I'm doing here. Let's just go back to home. Always start off at home is my motto. Stick out. Oh, I should explain what these things do. So I just moved the object around accidentally. I clicked on the wrong spot. Now I've moved the object right out of view. So the object, there's my camera view there, and the object is now sitting behind me somewhere here. I can see it's over here. You can always get it back in front of the camera by hitting this. It will always default it to back in front of the camera and also to the default elevation of 40. But if you lose an object, it's a really good way of finding that object again. And of course, you can get very lost in a Voyager landscape because they are infinite landscapes. So you can be randomly somewhere, anywhere in the landscape. And if you can put your object there by just clicking on that, it'll stick it right in front of you. So that's a really good way of doing that. And then the eye dialog puts the view right in the center of this window so you can kind of center yourself, which is quite useful. Let's just go back into our object again, and I'll just pop in some other color thing. Let's try the Mondrian one. You can see it's mapped there. Let's try color bubbles. Some of them map spherically better than others. What this is doing actually, it's actually a 3D tile. So it's putting the color uniformly through the object in 3D. It's not actually mapping it onto the surface so much. I'll show you mapping onto the surface in a bit as well. We're getting close to our 1 hour already. Oh, we need 3 hours on these things. Okay, so anyway, that's a very simple way of actually getting a color onto your object. Does that make sense? Is up to this point? Does you think you could do that? Yep. All right. So the next thing I'm going to show you on a simple object like a sphere, how to put a texture on that object. And there are a couple of ways of doing this. So let me just open, actually, I'll do that from inside Voyager. Let's have a look at this pre-prepared. Here's one I prepared earlier. This is putting a very simple texture on an object as well as some coloring. So let's have a look at the system of that and see what it looks like. It looks really weird because why is that happening? I'm just going to quit Designer and try that again because it should not look like that at all. What's going on here? I don't know what's happening here.
Looks all right in Voyager, doesn't it?
Yeah, I should be able to see this because I've played with this before. I'm just not sure what's going on.
Do you have to switch to geographic view?
No, what you have in here, it doesn't actually influence at all. These color tables don't influence the actual what happens to the object. They're just ways of viewing it inside of Voyager. So that shouldn't make a difference. Yeah, we were a long way from home. That's always a good thing to do. Just click on the home button and it will always kind of put you in home. I don't know why we were so far away, but anyway.
You're probably zoomed in too much. That's probably what.
Yeah, probably. I was just probably way zoomed in. So let's look at this system, and we'll see straight away there are some things that you should recognize quite easily, and that is there's an object here. Let's look at that object and we'll see that it's a sphere, and that makes perfect sense. We have a sphere. This, the basis for what we're doing here is a sphere. It's then mixed together using this algorithm. It's blending the alphas and colors. So it's blending the object with a system which defines some other things. And let's look at what those things are. It's a very simple system. It's just basically using this tile and taking from this tile some information, some color information and some depth field information. And then using a projection tile, it's projecting that particular thing onto the sphere using a spherical projection. So when we look at this inside of Voyager, we see this is a truly 3D texture. So move the light around, you can actually see that it's fully responsive to the light. Now that's a really good example of something that in a 3D program would actually be quite difficult to do, but it's very simple to do in Voyager. It's a very quick and simple way to do something, put a texture on something. We can do it in another way too, and I'm just going to, what will I do? I'll go back to my, let's go back to my, oopsie, not from here. Save that. I'm going to go back to my simple plane with my sphere on it, and we're going to have a look at the sphere. So bringing up the DF objects thing, going through into the ArtMatic system. Oops, had the plane selected, but I want the sphere. There's our sphere with its color pattern on it. I'm just going to do a very simple distortion of the sphere to give it some texture. And the way that I could do that is just by adding a noise module on top of it. So let's keep updating. We go back and look at it in Voyager. And we'll see that we now have a sphere which is not only colored, but it also has this kind of very lumpy texture on it as well. That's a very quick way to do, you're basically just distorting the space of the sphere above it and making it have a texture on it. So obviously if I whack the amplitude down a little bit here, it won't be quite as lumpy. So look at that. There's one way of giving your objects a texture. So let's go back into our simple texture example here and look at another way we could do that. So in this particular case, oh, it's done that again. It just doesn't want us. Let's see whether it was a zoom problem. Yeah, probably not. So what I need to do here is, I'm still in my shoot. What I need to do here is go looking inside here, and I'm going to change this into something else. Let's try random sticks. Not a good one. Mondrian's a good one. You can see that there is a kind of a texture there built up from the texture that comes inside that component. But what I could do is I could actually just put a texture in there in a different way. We would lose some of the color, because that's coming in from a different way. But what I'm going to do here is I'm going to put in a texture file. Actually, no, I'm going to put it outside here. I'm not going to use it as a projection, in fact. I'm going to do it in a completely different way. Get rid of that, get rid of that, get rid of that, get rid of that, get rid of that. And I'm going to create a 3D texture here by making this into a 3 in, 1 out tile. Now, you'll notice that that tile, the 3 in, 1 out tile, is very similar to that tile in that it is giving you the potential to drop in a shape if you wanted one. And we could, in fact, combine 2 shapes. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to put in a texture here and drop that down, connect that up, put in our very simple mixer here. It looks like a mess inside of Voyager. So look in Voyager, it's really quite a mess. And that's because the 2 things are mixed in a very extreme way. So I'm going to take the scaling down. Oopsie. This might be a hard way to do it here. I'm going to stick in a logic tool instead. Which will be a little easier. One thing that I lost when I did that, and which I need to get back, because this is where the where it becomes a lot easier to see what you're doing with the geographic thing. So this tells me something about this system here, and I need to see it. So I'm just going to make this very simple again by putting in a another color tile. Yeah. Constant. Just giving it a very simple color there. And I'm going to see. Blend. So I can tell just by looking at this what's happening. I'm blending this back in with my circle, with my sphere, hoping to put the texture on it, but it's not doing very well here. It's a bit too extreme. There we go. So what I did then is I took my object, that's my object there, and this is a 3D surface here. And using a logic tool, I subtracted the surface from the sphere, which gives me this ability to put a texture on the sphere. Now, this particular algorithm allows me to drop in different kinds of textures. So I'm just going to throw in one of these, and you'll see it's the same effect with a different texture. And the texture itself can be changed according to whatever its attributes are here. So that's another way of putting a texture on something. So the first way that I did it was to transform the space above the object in such a way as that it actually changed the object space and its description. And the second way was that I added the texture to it, which was essentially the same as when we had our little sphere here. Well, actually, that's kind of a third way, because that way I projected the texture onto it. So there are 3 ways of doing those textures. And of course, once you get to that point, you now have control of 2 things. This little module at the side here is controlling our object with our texture. That's this bit here. And it goes down into the DF part, which is this last part of the tile, which is the description of the depth field criteria. Then the other side controls our color. So we have the ability here now to change the way the color is actually put into this this particular tile. So let's make this like a 3 in, 4 out. Well, I'll show you something else actually. I'll make it a 4 in, 3 out. No, hang on, sorry, I won't do that. I'll make it a 3 in, 4 out. Go away. 3 in, 4 out. What I'm going to show you here is just another little trick. So I don't need to use all the 4 output components here. I can actually grab something and just take its color. So here, this tile here is actually giving me some information of 4 things. In this case, the last one is actually an alpha channel, but I don't need to take the alpha channel. I can actually just take the color channel and use that to actually color my object as well. Anything that has an RGB output can be used to distribute color. So here I have an object which is being distorted in its shape, its texture, and then on this side with its color. It's a very simple object, but you can kind of see that both of those things can play together. I could also, if I just put something like a 3 in, 3 out here, and I could add some color noise, gives me the ability to change its frequency up a bit. Come on, why are you not updating here? Quite sure why that's not doing its thing there. Huh. Don't know why that's not doing anything there. Let's try another one. Nor that one. Does it have to be in? Yes. Yeah, something funky in this system. I don't know quite sure what it is. It's an older system, so it might be carrying some kind of weird thing. Let's see how it shouldn't look like that. It keeps zooming right in for some reason. Shouldn't do that. It should always stay at that view unless I tell it not to, but it's being weird. All right, so there is one further thing that I can go on to now, but I think maybe I'll just stop and see if there are any questions you have at this point, and see if we can make sure that everything is actually clear as to where we are at this point.
Oh, it's perfectly clear to me. That was a really straightforward.
Yeah, I'm okay with that.
All right. Well, I'll go into explaining one further thing then. So now you feel confident you could make an object, a simple object. You could put a texture on that object and you could color that object. Okay, so that's a very useful thing to do. That means that you can now basically stick an object in the Voyager landscape, and you can make it look the way you want it to be, and it will cast shadows and so forth.
I think there's one thing that you probably haven't touched on, but it's probably not for now, is how to make the object interact in the Voyager scene with other things.
Yeah, so I think down the line a little bit, we'll get on to doing that. I think for the moment, I'm just really wanting you to get to the point where you feel confident enough to kind of just jump on that bandwagon. I mean, I know both you guys have already done this, but other people jump on that bandwagon and go, I'm going to embrace the idea that I can take control of sticking an object in the landscape. So the other thing, so there are many things we can talk about, of course. There's just an infinite number of things we could talk about. But the other thing that people quite frequently ask is, how do I move my object around in an animation? So I'm going to show you a very, very simple version of how to do that. So I'm going to load up here a movement test. And show you how one of the simplest ways just to move something through your landscape. So if you feel like grabbing one of Eric's spacecraft and flying it through your landscape, this is the easiest way to do it. So this is a system that's basically set up so that it just flies this cube through the landscape and rotates it. The rotation we'll talk about maybe, but really it's the motion that I'm interested in here. So let's look at the system for this. I'm just going to do exactly the same thing. I'm going to, because we're moving a cube, so I'm going to go into my DF objects. We're going to look at this module which I've made, and we're going to have a look at what it looks like. So let's just zoom in a little bit. You can see there's a cube. It's a red cube, which is exactly what we expect because that's what we have in our landscape here. So what's happening here is very simple. I'm not going to talk about this particular tile at the moment. This controls the rotation, but here's the cube in the bottom here. So we'll look in here and straight away, this should look familiar to you. So this is our object here, and this is the color. It's a red cube, very simple. So forget this one. This is controlling, when you saw that flying through there, you saw that cube, it's rotating. That module controls the rotation, but we're not going to be interested in that at the moment. What we're going to be interested in is this tile here, which is controlling the movement of the cube. And what I've done, again, this is a very, very simple system. It's quite easy. So anything you stick underneath, if you put these tiles here and connect them this way, it will do this to anything that's underneath. So any DF object, say it was one of Eric's spacecraft, was sitting here, this is what it will do to that object. And it's moving the object across the plane like that, really only doing it in one dimension, or we could do it in more dimensions if we wanted to. So that's what it's doing. It's going from one point and moving across. One thing you'll know if you've done animation in Designer, one thing you'll immediately kind of say is, hey, there's only one keyframe in here. And that's because the movement is not controlled by keyframes. It's actually controlled by time. And this is something that you'll be familiar with now, Steve, because this is a W component. This feeds into the system and it feeds time into the system. So what I'm basically saying to this system is take something, move it from here to here over a certain amount of time. And let's have a look at that. Time, it's going into this component, which is just basically being used as an offset to give it a little bit more distance, and into this component. And this component is an offset, of a space offset. So like our 2D space offsets, where we can move things along the X and the Y axis, this is a 3D space offset controlled by whatever I want to stick in this last input. So I put time in there, and I've said offset it this much according to the time that's flowing into the system. So that's what's happening. It's actually putting time in and it's offsetting along the X-axis. So if we go back into Voyager and have a look at this, you can see this is where I've placed my ArtMatic system. So it's a good idea to think about this thing, which is where we place things. Remember, we moved these things around before, and it does move the cube around, but rather than thinking about it moving the cube, you should be thinking about it as moving the ArtMatic system itself, because it's also going to move the motion. So when I go like this now, you'll see that it's changed where it is, but it's still doing the essential same thing, traveling in a straight line as defined. So if I move it, if I go and move it over here now and hit play, it's coming from this side. It's still traveling along that axis of motion that I defined in ArtMatic, but it's moved the whole thing, the whole kit and caboodle has been moved. So it's basically moving in a straight line, but I could have it moving in a much more complex way if I just allow the time in that other system to influence more parameters. So in this particular case, it's only influencing the X-axis, but if I made a slight Y offset and a slight Z offset, it's going to be hard to tell what it will do because I haven't actually worked it out. I'll stick it back in here somewhere and we'll hit play and we'll see what happens. Okay, so it's moved it. Okay, let's just move it over a bit further. So I think you can see what happened there. It actually now has moved it not only in the X-axis, but it's actually moving its altitude as well. It's moving it down. So those things are something that you want to actually kind of be fairly, careful of. You can see this motion happening here, but you see how it disappeared in this particular case. That's because it's moved out of the slice that we're looking at. It's moving down.
Did you define the time it takes to move in ArtMatic Designer or in Voyager?
So it's defined in Designer. So the amount of time it takes to move is defined in Designer, and it's defined in two places in this particular case. So it's the amount of time it takes over. So the time is just a constant input value. If you can connect it to Z, and that's a different kind of time that will happen over a keyframe time. But for just general influence of time into a system over a very regular way, use the W. And then this offset, this scaling offset, can influence that. But in this particular case, the scaling is not doing anything at all. I put it in there because, I've gone, I may need to make it bigger, but I didn't actually in the end. In fact, I could take it out, it wouldn't make any difference. So it's really the amount of offset of X, which is controlling how far it travels and how fast. So if I was to jack this up a bit, it would actually speed it right up. In fact, I'm a little loath to do it because I think it'll make it so much faster. These are often very quick increments. Yeah, so it made it very, very fast that time. Or I could slow it down. So if I was to make it, so let's say 0.5. Go across to Voyager. Still updating something, I think. It's going quite a bit slower now. So it's just the amount of offset over time that dictates how quickly or slowly that will go. But you should play with that now, because really that's all you need to do. Just grab those tiles, which you can look at from this tutorial, put that one in there and have your object underneath it. You'll see your object in here, so you can kind of work out roughly what the time of that object will be as it moves. Just be wary of moving anything on the Z-axis, because when you do that, it will disappear below the plane that Designer is looking at. And that's one of the difficult things about modeling inside of ArtMatic Designer, as opposed to other modeling programs, where you can actually see things a lot clearer. So it kind of needs a bit of mental gymnastics to understand it. But just keep in mind that you're seeing a kind of a cross-section plane right at 0 on the Z-axis. So that's what it's doing. So if you move things up and down on the Z-axis, they're going to disappear from your point of view on this window. There are ways you can kind of move the Z-axis to see it, but that gets a bit complicated too. So, okay, so that's really the last thing I wanted to cover in this tutorial, because I think now you've got enough information to make an object, color the object, texture the object, and move it around a little bit inside the Voyager landscape. They're kind of like the 4 key things you may want to do with an object. Maybe in the next one, what we'll do is we'll look at how objects interact with the landscapes, and we'll look at more complex objects, how we can, so those simple objects, they're very, very simple objects, and they're just out of the bunch of things you have available to you. But we can make much more complex objects by combining objects, by lathing objects, by having the objects interact in Boolean ways. There's many ways that we can actually do it, by tiling them, by mirroring them. There's many ways you can do it. And it's very, very rapid to do this kind of thing when you're talking about DF modeling, because it's all procedural. And it means that, for instance, you can make a very complex object with only a very few components and only a few minutes, where the same object would maybe take you an hour or more to do in a conventional 3D application. So I'll call it quits for now. Are there any further questions about what we've talked about today that we could kind of clear up?
With this one example of the cube moving through time, in the Voyager, I noticed it had 2 keyframes. Is that just to enable it to animate? No,
sorry, yes, that's a good point. You must have 2 keyframes here, because Voyager won't actually interpret movement unless you do. So it's these 2 keyframes are actually identical. So I can actually, and I'll show you. I can't do that quickly. I was going to show you, I was just going to move the camera to somewhere else. Oh, I can do it quickly, actually. Let me just delete it. Now I'm going to hit the dice. Where's our dice? So it's moved us to a completely random place in the Voyager landscape. I'm going to put the ArtMatic cube system in front of the camera. So, and I'm going to center the camera. I'll just zoom out a bit and see there's our cube system. I'll move it much closer to us. The cube is there. Now, I can't tell what this motion is going to do because I actually don't know. So, but let's just play it and see whether it brings our cube through. It might have moved it off in a different direction. So there's really no way of knowing this without setting it up to do that.
But any keyframes in yet? No.
Oh, I don't have any keyframes. No, because it won't do anything. That's what I was demonstrating, wasn't it? So now the two keyframes are in the same problem though. I don't know where the cube has gone. It might be moving behind us or something. Let's just move it a bit further away from camera. So I can't even see it there. Let's make it bigger actually. That's always a good thing to do because it makes it very obvious if it's around. Put it in front of camera. Bring it back here somewhere. Yeah, I can't actually see it there. I don't know where it is. 100.
It's probably underwater.
It could be, shouldn't be underwater.
You've got the cube at 100 meters elevation of the sea level.
Yeah, that's what I'm thinking.
And let's make this 200. Let's go back here. Now the cube's there, okay. Yeah, it's underground, that's why. It's underground at this particular moment. Let's just move our ground down. Oops. And we'll go back into here and we'll stick our cube. Let's just stick our camera somewhere out to see. And you can see how lost you can get in this stuff. Stick the cube in front of camera, stick the cube at 300 meters. There we are, there's our cube. All right.
Very big cube.
So now if I just delete those two keyframes and make two keyframes here, the motion is preserved. So when I hit play, the cube will come into view eventually, I think. There it is. So those two keyframes are actually identical. All they are doing is saying, we want motion to happen here. And the cube, obviously, I just bung that cube in anywhere. So it's kind of just going to be random, but you design your motion so it happens where you want it to be inside.
The water's surface and the clouds can also move.
That's correct. So if you have, in your environment setting here, if you have, there's several things which will dictate this, and I think if you have the roughness setting up here on the sea, yes, there you go. When you do that, that will also animate, independently will animate your ocean and your clouds. Let's just, the roughness. Oh, I have to reset the two keyframes to do that though. So the clouds will animate now, the water surface will be animating and the cube will come flying through there in a minute, I guess. There you go. Yeah, so that kind of animation is independent of keyframing. So it's really just, again, it's just basically saying, stick two keyframes in and animate between those two things, but those keyframes are identical. And I'll show you, I'll just delete them and I'll put them back in again and it will still animate the clouds because that's independent of your keyframing, really. Makes sense?
Yep, thank you.
Can I take it that in terms of the cube moving in a straight line, you could just as easily animate that just within Voyager without using time in the ArtMatic designer file, but on the other hand, it would make it a lot more difficult to do the tumbling. Is it?
That's correct. So you can now, because the object's positions can be remembered, you can animate between two object positions. So you could do it like that. It does kind of constrain you to certain kinds of things, though. It's just a little difficult to make complex motions. And it's more controllable inside of Designer. Plus the rotation is another thing. So if we look back inside that system, you couldn't do the rotation. You can't change the orientation of something inside of Voyager. There's no way of doing that. But we look inside this tile here, that's changing the rotation, and you'll see there's a rotation tile, and this rotation tile is actually determined by a saw wave, which is moving the cube into one position and then repeating that position over and over. There are other ways of doing that kind of motion as well. So for instance, I've just rendered out another one of my Heisenberg Zeppelin things, and I have little engines on it with propellers. So the propellers are actually controlled by time coming into the system. They just keep on going around and around and around as long as that thing is moving. So the motion of the actual Zeppelin is controlled in the way we just controlled that cube, and then the motion of the rotating propellers are controlled by time doing a constant rotation on the propellers. So whilst you could quite easily move the Zeppelin using the object positions inside of Voyager, you certainly could not rotate the propellers in that way.
Right, okay.
So.
And so going back to one of Eric's spaceships, you could arrange it to fly through a valley, but it would
Absolutely, you could do
be
that.
a bit involved to make it do that.
You can make it bank. You can change it. It doesn't have to fly in a straight line. You can actually make the path curve. You need to kind of. It's the difficult thing is that. So my rule of thumb is this: if you want a motion inside a Voyager, if you wanted to do that, let's say you wanted to have a spacecraft fly in a curve and bank. What you need to do is first set that whole motion up inside of Designer. Have it go from right to left, have it do that curve in the window, you can see it, have the bank programmed into the object orientation, all inside of Designer in one thing that you can see on the screen, and then position it correctly inside of Voyager. Because if you set up a scene and you try and fly your craft through that scene, you'll find your brain will not be able to do the calculations. You just go, oh my God, I can't figure out what's going on. Set up your motion first and then stick it in the scene. The other thing that I didn't show you is that you can actually change the directions of things quite easily. So this tile here is just kind of looking at the whole system from the top. But if I was to put in a rotation tile here, this is just the orientation of that cube. So I can actually move. So at the moment, if we look at this file, you can see it's moving from right to left, but I can actually change, if I move its orientation on the y-axis, on the x-axis, like that, it will now change its direction. Oopsie, what didn't I do? I didn't redo the keyframe. I've got to lock it first. Everything has to be locked when you're doing these systems because it won't update this keyframe if they're not. So now it's, instead of it moving from right to left, it's now moving from top to bottom, which will cause it to be different when it's in Voyager. It'll move in a different direction now. I don't know whether we'll be able to see it in this system. I'll have to move it into shot somewhere, I think. You can see you have to actually work these things out in advance because it's a little bit difficult to just do these on spec. There we go. So it's actually moving now in a completely different direction from low to high because I changed the orientation. So obviously, once you set your system up inside of Voyager, you've got it traveling in a straight line. If you want it to travel from camera to behind, you've got to swivel it, the whole system around for you to do that. But you play with that stuff and get it correct. So you just need to put a tile like that in to do that, to actually change its orientation to the camera. But its motion is still all just controlled by these. So it's still doing that straight line. It's just doing the straight line in a different direction.
Today.
All right, I guess we should call it quits. That's an hour and a half again. We seem to hit that hour and a half.
Awesome. Let's see here.
Have you stopped the recording, Caleb?
Yet, one moment here. And sorry about that. I realized my mic was on and my wife came in and started talking to me. so, um, so yeah, I'd love to, in a future episode, dig into that idea of banking and how to handle that. That's definitely something I'm interested in. I've seen a number of people purchase the Deep Space Library and have questions about
Yeah,
moving objects.
that's a relatively simple thing to do. So when I had that cube rotating there, that's all it's doing is just moving the orientation of the cube. So with a spacecraft, it's really simple. I mean, you're basically going to just tilting it a bit. It's a really simple thing to do. So having a spacecraft bank is really easy because you've got it flying in a direction like this. You just map a keyframe that says, I want it to start there. And when it gets to here, I want it to be tilted like that. And that tilting is handled inside of Designer.
Rather than using a tile with X, Y, Z so it travels in a defined straight line, can you put it onto, say, a parabolic curve and have it fly along that?
You absolutely you could do that, but you just set up your motion beforehand in whatever direction you want it to do. Absolutely, you can do that. Sure, you could do that. That would not change the banking though, because that's the object itself.
Yeah, orientation. Yeah.
Yeah. So you could have its path changing like that, but then what you'd need to do is actually change it's the object's orientation as well. They're two different things, if you follow what I mean. So the object travels on a path, but then what it does on that path is independent of the path it's traveling on. Both of those things you would set up inside of Voyager, and both of those things you can do in a number of ways. I mean, you can have it doing a wobbling motion, which could be done completely automatically, or you can keyframe it. You can so time can be controlling it if you want, or keyframe can be controlling it if you want. I mean, there's many ways of doing that.
Well, Peter, thank you again for a great episode of helping us dig deeper into ArtMatic, both Designer and Voyager, and really understand the interplay between the two applications, which I think for many customers is a mystery, and you're helping remove the shroud of mystery on that. I want to be respectful of your time and wrap up and say one footnote. I did text Dick about the scaling. You said there was a model or preset or something that we could use to understand.
He did a really good tutorial. It's in that document that you saved, and it tells you. It goes over that kind of thing of making a sphere and putting it into a landscape and how big that sphere is in the landscape. It's a really useful tutorial. It's very simple. But if we can make those things available somewhere, that would be really cool. If there's a place we could put those kinds of things. There's so many good tutorials that were on the wiki. It would be a shame not to lose them. So some things like the texturing of objects, for instance, in Designer, I did a whole tutorial of that. And it has step-by-steps and all kinds of stuff. So it's probably, it's really useful to have those things available, I think. So if there's a way we can do it, it would be good.
I took it all and copy and pasted into a Word document and made a PDF, and it's currently on the legacy site.
Right. Well, maybe
but I'll move it over to the new site.
Yeah, put a link up somewhere just so people can, because you have to scroll through and find it, but it's still useful to have that because it has some really, really helpful stuff in it. I go back to it from time to time because Dick has written some really good things there, and I'll go back and I'll go, I remember he did that, and I can't quite work out what this is doing, so I'll have a look at that tutorial. And I think that's a very valuable bunch of stuff that people did. And there's all Paul did a really good one as well about patterns and stuff on DF objects. It's of great value, I think.
Awesome. I'll make sure that gets reposted.
Yeah, cool.
All right, everybody, I'm going to stop recording.